There is another striking phenomenon which cannot be explained by either the hereditary or the environmental theory of IQ differences, as heredity and environment are usually conceived. That is the fact that females are several times as numerous as males among blacks with high IQs, despite the fact that black males and black females inherit the same genes and are raised in the same homes and neighborhoods. Yet a cultural explanation seems more consistent with these findings as well, since the particular culture in which most blacks have lived for centuries, like the culture of white Southerners in the past, has emphasized especially macho roles for males. It is hardly surprising if such a culture inhibited the intellectual development of both blacks and whites, especially males, in the South. There may be another but different environmental reason for the male-female differences in IQs among blacks. There is evidence that females in general are less affected by environmental disadvantages of various sorts than are males. This possibility is independent of the peculiarities of the culture of the South, which would apply to other groups with a very different culture, but who have low IQs for other reasons. Which factor carries more weight is hard to determine. Since there was no mass mental testing of white Southern females during the era when there was mass mental testing of white Southern males in the U.S. Army, we have no way to know whether there was a similar IQ difference between the sexes in the white Southern population at that time. However, there are data on sex differences between males and females among Jews back during the early 20th century when Jews scored below average on mental tests. In that era, Jewish girls scored higher than Jewish boys on mental tests. Further evidence that the male-female difference in IQs among blacks is cultural is that black orphans raised by white families show no such female superiority in IQs, in addition to both sexes having higher average IQs than other black children. It should also be noted that the male-female difference on average IQs among blacks is only a few points, but, due to the characteristics of a bell curve, a small difference in average IQs translates into a large difference in male-female representation at high IQ levels. Since these high IQ levels are common among students at elite colleges and among people in elite occupations, their impact on demographic representation in such conspicuous places can be considerable. There is other evidence that environment cannot be usefully defined solely in terms of current gross external circumstances, such as income levels or even levels of education. More important, environment cannot be defined solely in terms of surrounding circumstances at a given time. During the era of mass immigration to the United States, for example, it was common for Italian and Jewish children to be raised in similar low-income neighborhoods and to sit side by side in the same classrooms. Yet the Jewish children began to improve educationally before the Italian children, who were mostly the offspring of Southern Italian parents. Nor was this at all surprising, in light of different cultural attitudes that prevailed among Jews and among Southern Italians, long before these children were born. Even uneducated Jews respected education, while the imposition of compulsory education in southern Italy was not only resisted but evaded, and in places even led to riots and the burning of schoolhouses. However similar the immediate circumstances of Italian and Jewish school children were on the Lower East Side of New York, each trailed the long shadow of the cultural history and tradition in which they were raised, and those histories and traditions were very different. Just as the preferences of progressive-era intellectuals for genetic explanations of group differences led them to give little attention to cultural explanations of intergroup differences in educational achievement, so the preferences of intellectuals in the second half of the 20th century for external social explanations, racial segregation and/or discrimination in schools being prominent, led them to likewise overlook cultural explanations. But research on a school in a large metropolitan area in the North from 1932 through 1953 found IQ differences between Jewish and Italian children attending that school to be as persistent over the years as black-white IQ differences in racially segregated schools in the South, and IQ differences between Jewish and Puerto Rican youngsters in that same school to be not only as persistent but as large as IQ differences between black and white youngsters attending different racially segregated schools in the Jim Crow-era South. There were similar IQ differences among Mexican American and Japanese American youngsters living in the same school district out west, at a place and time where there was little occupational difference among their parents. Cultural differences with educational consequences are not peculiar to the United States. When Maori students, admitted under preferential policies at New Zealand's University of Auckland, failed to show up for tutorials as often as other students, their academic failures cannot be attributed automatically to institutional racism or to not having enough role models. Not if the purpose is to advance Maoris rather than to protect a vision. It should be noted that an internal explanation of racial differences, even if it is cultural rather than genetic, deprives intellectuals of a moral melodrama and the opportunity that presents to be on the side of the angels against the forces of evil. There are, of course, times to take moral stands on particular issues, but that is very different from saying that issues in general, or racial issues in particular, are to be automatically conceived in ways that create a moral melodrama. Yet internal explanations of economic outcome differences among Americans have become so taboo that it was literally front-page news in the New York Times when a conference was held on the possibility that a culture of poverty existed, and that this culture helped explain disparate economic and other outcomes among the poor in general, or blacks in particular.